continuing this webinar series on democracy going. I am Ben Conklin. I'm here with
Regina Yunt.
And we are coming at you from North Carolina, Statesville to be precise. Very excited about democracy in decline. Is democracy in decline? A civil conversation using the Constitutional Rights Foundation's civil conversation model, helping teachers engage with content in meaningful ways by promoting discussion with our students that's focused, enlightening, and creates connections for even further learning down the road.
Just to give you guys a little bit of background on us, in case you were thinking that you should know where Statesville, North Carolina is, you probably don't. We are just north of Charlotte. So Ben teaches high school and I teach middle school. So we try to give you both of those comparisons, and we'll both kind of chime in with our individual levels and what's appropriate at those separate levels.
The civil conversation model is a great tool to use in the classroom because it can be modeled and used for a variety of classroom settings, regardless of what kind of students you have, what subjects you teach. Now, most of our experience is with English and social studies, but the civil conversation model from the Constitutional Rights Foundation can be adapted to meet a variety of classroom needs. The civil conversation webinar today has four main goals that we're going to go through. One is to introduce the activity that focuses on using in-text discussions. We use text-based evidence to drive meaningful discussions with our students.
We also want to connect with the reading, listening, and writing standards. I know that when we have our instructional coaches that come in, our principals that come in, even though we teach history and social studies, they love it when they see those other subjects being blended in.
Our third goal is to explain the ingredients of the civil conversation versus maybe other types of academic discussion that you've attempted to have in class. So we're going to differentiate between the two, and most importantly, really explain the ingredients that make the civil conversation model so effective.
And we're also going to actually provide real practice tonight with the civil conversation, the CRS model, with an article also from the Constitutional Rights Foundation called Democracy in Decline. So we're also going to show you that site so that you can use even more great materials that they have.
Now, we do want to interact with our participants tonight, and I know that seems like it could be a little bit awkward in our setting. How exactly do you have a civil conversation across time and space with a format like this? But we are going to engage with the actual document within the lesson itself and ask you to give us some feedback and basically learn from the lesson so that when we deliver it in the classroom, we're already comfortable, almost taking on the role of a student as we look at the lesson tonight. So why do we use academic discourse in our classrooms? We know that our time in class is very valuable, and teachers often get frustrated when they try to use lessons that take longer or use more resources than they originally anticipated. Sometimes we shy away from academic or the purposeful attempt of academic discourse in our classrooms, but we want to get students to access material and to generate questions about particular issues or content that we're using in class. So why do we use academic discourse in our classrooms? What are the benefits of using academic discourse over some other instructional strategies? Regina and I would like to invite you to comment in our text box. What do you personally feel the benefits of using academic discourse in your classrooms are? Are there certain lessons that you know incorporate academic discourse that are go-to lessons for you that you've proven to be successful? Are there perhaps certain types of students that you know benefit from discussion more than others? When we think about it, Regina and I have come to rely on using academic discourse in our classes because we've seen it proven effective. Perhaps because the Constitutional Rights Foundation has created such engaging lessons, but we know that when students have discourse in a meaningful way and use text-based evidence to do so, they create lasting understanding. It often gives them ownership in a way of the material that they're going over and builds, most importantly, skills that they use in other classes as well. It's not just about dealing with the material, it's about building skills that are used to not just reinforce the material, but also deliver it to others.
That's what I really like about the model that we're going to talk about tonight. I know Sean has chimed in as well. He uses articles from Chegg. We've talked about those before. That's a great source. Procon.org also has these type of articles. And then we're going to also find out tonight that Constitutional Rights Foundation is full of this type of article.
Excellent. So we want to remind us that what we're doing touches on the Common Core standards across both English and social studies. Again, we don't want to feel like we're robbing time from other things we could be doing in class. We are using this model because it does use the exact types of standards we're supposed to be addressing. It's really about using research and material that we're covering in class to fuel well-reasoned exchanges. Is Democracy in Decline is the title of our article today, and some of us may argue that it is. We would say that democracy cannot thrive if citizens are unable to have well-reasoned exchanges of ideas. Exchanges of ideas is how we solve problems. Democracy is supposed to be solving problems, not be the cause of them. So as we scroll through these next couple of slides here, we see that for a variety of reasons, standards are addressed when using the civil conversation model that the Constitutional Rights Foundation provides us with. It offers us to engage with content from diverse perspectives. We're forced to qualify and justify our own views that we have. We're not being taught what to believe. We're being taught how to think and express our ideas and beliefs with well-reasoned evidence.
It does seem time-consuming at the start, and there is some prep work, but once you do it, and again, doing it again, whenever you do the civil conversations, you don't want to just stop at one. You want to continue to do that. It gives you a huge bang for your buck. The connections they make, the depth that the students go in when they have these really is what you're looking for.
So some of the ideas that we've heard of when posing what types of discussion we use in class and meaningful ways, we see that in our courses already we use discourse such as Socratic seminars or debates, maybe a structured academic controversy is how some would have referred to it, other assorted jigsaw puzzles. The civil conversation model has many of the strengths that these other ways have, but also goes beyond some of these other methods to create a simple, formulaic task that students can follow and really benefit from. We may think that in our classrooms, discussion devolves into something far away from what our original attempt was. In the picture on the left here, we see that perhaps instead of a meaningful exchange of ideas, sometimes in our classroom, academic discourse can take on the appearance of supporting claims with not well-reasoned evidence, or perhaps maybe we are looking at the same pieces of evidence, but we don't come away with the same understanding. Many of us can read the same story, watch the same film, but of course walk away with different interpretations. So this is about how we interpret information and then share it with others. On the right, we see that sometimes meaningful discussion is not achieved, and instead people approach the opportunity more as a competition. It's framed in a I win and they lose type way. And that's not what civil and meaningful conversations in and outside of our classroom should look like. These are not what's meant by academic discourse. Our interpretation and our civil conversation model goes deeper than this. It's not a competition about who won and who lost. It's about listening and coming to greater understanding. It's about understanding different perspectives, understanding why we believe what we do, and then sharing that information with others.
One thing I do in the middle school, because they say, especially when they first start off, and we start talking about this, they'll use the term debate. And I really discourage them with that term, because a debate looks often like what's over on the right-hand side. The picture on the right-hand side where one person's trying to beat up the other person, you're trying to win. That is not the purpose of the CRF civil conversation model. It's about learning, it's about growth, using text-based evidence, well-reasoned opinions from the text, and it's not about how you feel, or especially for middle school students, it's not about how your parents feel about a subject.
So how do we achieve this blending of ideas and perhaps coming to a common understanding? Even if we don't ultimately agree with each other, we know that we have valid reasons as to why we might believe a certain thing. It all goes back to, again, the recipe of what makes a civil conversation so effective. Ultimately, the idea is to take a controversial issue that every student can then approach and participate in. It's very structured, forcing students to take evidence-based content or material and discuss it. They do this with the use of a very structured discussion guide that ultimately can be used as a formal or informal assessment, not just by you as the educator, but by the students themselves, who when practicing this type of model really do take ownership of it. My students in particular get excited when I say we're going to have a activity in class that utilizes the civil conversation model. They've taken ownership of it and they look forward to coming to a greater understanding with each other with text-based evidence. So why use the civil conversation? Again, it takes us from varied perspectives. Perhaps we're talking about issues that are difficult for students to visualize on their own, but in these small settings that the conversation model utilizes, allows them to approach different perspectives and deal with issues that might not really seem to affect us, but that affect all communities. Because a democracy is all about solving problems for a community, and we can't solve problems unless we have a shared understanding. So instead of approaching a controversial issue as more of a debate, we frame it as a conversation in the hopes of coming to common understanding that can lead to problems being solved. Because wherever you fall on the political spectrum or with the different perspectives on a particular issue, ultimately we don't really learn a whole lot from people we already agree with. I know I learn more from people that disagree with me, especially when they have valid reasons as to why, than I do from people that automatically agree with me. So the shared understanding is achieved in full measure when using these civil conversation ingredients.
So I guess that means our conversations, you tend to agree with me a lot.
Yeah, something like that. I always agree with you, Regina. Of course.
Absolutely.
My wife trained me well. What are you talking about?
Absolutely.
So the conversation ingredients includes text-based, using an article. The Constitutional Rights Foundation provides many of these activities with an article that presents at least two perspectives, but sometimes maybe even more than one article, promoting a variety of different perspectives. They present a question that students are given or encouraged to come up with their own questions that really help drive the conversation. These conversations happen in small groups or in pairs so that no one individual student can hide in the larger class setting. They are kept on pace and structured with a discussion guide, and there are clear ground rules for the civil conversation itself to take place.
So I really feel like that this structure allows the kids to be a part of this conversation safely by having the ground rules, by it being very small in the initial conversations so that they don't feel concerned about talking or sharing their viewpoints. And that overall, that's what really helps them practice those reading, listening, and their speaking skills.
The process really is easy. It's 4 steps. 1, they read and annotate the article that's given as part of the Constitutional Rights Foundation lesson. The rules for annotating are provided on the Civil Conversation Guide, which leads them to step 2, where they describe and analyze the content that they've now been exposed to. It's presented in a simple graphic organizer that helps keep them on task. They then use that material that they put in step 2 to drive the discussion as they listen to each other's viewpoints. And then perhaps most importantly, in step 4, they reflect on the learning that has taken place, on the perspectives that have now been shared, and they respond to each other and themselves about their role in this process. So we're going to go through these 4 steps in a little bit more detail and use the example of Democracy in Decline as our main vehicle. So if we would, we're pointing you to where you can find this actual lesson itself from the Constitutional Rights Foundation. In the text box, there is a link that's been provided. You should be able to click right on it, or if not, you can type this in a address bar, and we're going to take a moment as you navigate to the Constitutional Rights Foundation website. Their Challenges of Democracy series. in which you use the Democracy in Decline article.
So this will help us all truly get on the same page.
Yeah, no pun intended. We're going to be on the same page here as you download this article. We're going to interact with it in a moment. For now, you don't have to worry about really going through it at all. Just make sure that you have access to it. We are going to have a civil conversation, or at least put ourselves in the shoes of our students who would be involved in a civil conversation concerning the topic, is democracy in decline. Now, as adults, as educators, we may pay attention to the news a little bit more than our students would, but even our younger students have this general sense that things in our society are not as well as they could be. Perhaps the vision of ourselves that we're shown on television is inaccurate, but whether it's accurate or not, we are definitely shown an image of ourselves that does not look healthy. Democracy may at least appear to be in decline, whether it is or not. One of the things Regina and I were discussing earlier is that sometimes if democracy is happening like it's supposed to, it looks messy. Sometimes democracy appears to not be working, but it actually is. It just doesn't come across clean and sanitized, does it? So let's focus this discussion. This would be like a hook that you would use in class, as some of us may be continuing to navigate to that article and drawing it up. Let's focus ourselves with the discussion or some discussion questions that you may use in class as part of this lesson.
And that's really one of the ingredients. Whatever article you use, and this is a great one to start off with, but whatever article you use, you want to start with a question that helps to focus the kids as well.
It helps provide context. And the articles from the Constitutional Rights Foundation, especially this Decline in Democracy one, do a really good job of providing context. So even before the articles themselves are dispersed, you as the educator might want to focus the question, use a focus question rather in class to help create context. Like this one, how do you define democracy? Perhaps people define democracy in a variety of ways. I would elicit some responses from my students and ask them what they think, and that would help drive conversation further, particularly towards question 2, what is your role in a democracy? Now, I may take this as an opportunity with my students to talk about particular duties and responsibilities of citizens within a democracy, carefully differentiating between the two. Duties being things that citizens must do, or perhaps they face fines or jail time, maybe serving on a jury when asked to, or if drafted in the military during times of war, following laws, paying taxes, attending school. These are duties that citizens are required to do or they face penalty. Whereas responsibilities are things that we should do as citizens, but there aren't necessarily consequences if we don't. So your role in a democracy might be to fulfill certain duties, but also some of those responsibilities, like maybe vote or stay informed, participate in events, respect others and their property. These are all things that citizens must do to have a productive society. Maybe we can talk about specific examples with our students about what they feel their role in a democracy is. And once we understand what democracy means and what our roles in a constitutional democratic republic like our own nation, we can begin to move forward with our step 1, engaging the actual article itself. Now, if you've pulled this article from the Constitutional Rights Foundation, we'd like to take a highlight of step 1 here as an opportunity for you to read the introduction of the article. As a student, you would be expected to annotate the text, engage with the text. We see here, we refer to it as talk to the text. This is the first step in the civil conversation model. Students are asked to underline what they think to be the main ideas or most important points in an article. Perhaps they underline claims. They're asked to circle certain phrases that they think are unknown and confusing. And you as the teacher can ask students what they circled and maybe define certain things or come to some understanding about particular words before the class discussions happen. Maybe they draw arrows in the margin that connect certain things to information that they already know. After all, one of the most important things about the civil conversation model is to drive connections that really lead to lasting understanding. So you're not being asked to annotate your text right now, but just go ahead and make sure you read the introduction to this article if you would. And that will lead us to our next step, where we'll engage with the material a little bit more. Regina, as we mentioned, the constitutional rights lessons do a really good job of providing context within the articles themselves. And our participants are probably just now realizing that with this particular lesson, it's not an exception. That the introduction does a good job of framing the issue and leaving it open to students to come to their own conclusion.
Now, teachers, hopefully you are underlining, but I'm certainly hoping that there's not a lot of circling going on. If there is, I'm sure that there's another student chat that you can join somewhere else, but we are hoping that most of what you're getting is underlining and arrows.
Yeah, we don't need teachers right now circling this.
That's right.
All right, so that probably got you through the introduction of the article itself. And that leads us to step 2. Step 2 is describe and analyze. And moving along with our civil conversation guide, we see that step 2 is presented in a very clean graphic organizer that lets students track what the overall summary of the article might be, particular main points or claims, things that they agree and disagree. Here is where they might elicit certain evidence that backs up claims, for example. And then in the third, or the last component there, we see that there's a spot for 2 questions that students can come up with, prompted by the reading. So sometimes these questions are provided to the students, and then maybe sometimes in addition to the ones provided or in lieu of, students come up with their own questions. Now, Regina, I know you did want to talk about this for a moment because you feel it does a really good job of building or growing to understanding, right?
Yeah, I think I really like the progression, and they have it labeled A, B, C, D, E, so that the students can see that really well. So they start off very generally with a general thought. My students' comments on those are really very, very general, but then it really helps them to narrow kind of focus. So they go to B, which is the summary. Then they've got the agree and the disagree, which is important for them to see that they can be both, and that having that both of those ideas helps them see the other person's viewpoint. And then again, that last part with adding their own questions to let them know. For some of you, this may be very similar to what that you refer to as like a think, ink, pair, and share. This particular part 2, I think, is critical, especially for middle school students. That especially helps the shy students that may not speak out in class very often because they're afraid, either because they don't feel as smart as some of their other classmates, they just don't like to talk out and draw attention to themselves. But this allows them time to gain their confidence, and it gives them points to come back to so that they're not as nervous. I've really seen this particular section take that shy child and make them a participant, and it's really surprising to see the kids that really grow in this process when they're not talking out with the whole group, but they're talking with 2 or 3 other students.
All right. So as adult learners, we're not asking our participants to actually fill out the graphic organizer, but Regina and I thought it might be appropriate to share a tactic that we use with our students with creating quote sandwiches. What this graphic organizer helps us do is lead to discussions that are based on claims backed by evidence and are well-reasoned. It's all about claims, evidence, reasoning. This is what's supposed to drive the students' understanding and reinforce the content. So as adult learners, we thought maybe we would ask you to engage with another portion of the article itself, choose one of the sides, either democracy is on the rise or in decline. It's clearly articulated in the article itself. But instead of acting as a student, this is ultimately, if we've done correctly, how a student would converse with each other. But written out, it might come across as more of a quote sandwich. It's really just introducing the source of your content, stating the source and maybe the opinion, providing the actual evidence, either in the form of a direct quote or a paraphrase, and then providing the explanation, the analysis of how that evidence is attached to the claim, how it reinforces the claim. So taken from the introduction of the article, for example, if I was going to create a quote sandwich from the Is Democracy in Decline article, in the intro it says, according to the intro in the article, quote, by the end of the 1990s, 120 of the world's 192 nations had adopted such constitutions. These numbers reinforce the idea democracy is on the rise. Now, obviously, that little excerpt is taken out of context, but if you read through the introduction, you might take a different understanding. Perhaps you have a different impression or interpretation of that quote. But this is just a quick example of how you can create a quote sandwich And I would use this language when discussing the material with my fellow students if I was doing this in class. This is a skill that I try to cultivate with my students, building quote sandwiches, and they then take these same concepts and use them in the civil conversation guide again and again. So when students actually do start conversing with each other, they're discussing the material that they had added to their graphic organizers in step 2, the describe and analyze step. But we have to remind our students of the important rules that govern a civil conversation. The first rule is everyone needs to participate equally. The students are encouraged to police themselves, to want to involve themselves in the conversation and add to it. But it's really not about how much you talk. Really, the second rule is arguably the most important. How good of a job do they do listening? This is something we really want to stress with our students when using the civil conversation guide. It's all about listening. Someone, especially if they disagree with you, is not going to really care what you have to say unless they feel that you've listened to them or are willing to listen to them too. Listening is sometimes the hardest part for students. They're not going to yell at each other and think they get credit for how loud they say stuff instead of what they actually say. But they are willing to already try to start thinking about what they want to say before the other person's even done talking. And it's not that they're trying to be rude or very purposefully malice in any way, but they do struggle with this idea of, I need to be an active listener. And if you can show those people that you're engaging in this lesson with that you are a good listener, they're far more likely to listen to you as well. And hey, one of the ways that you can prove you're listening is this third rule, ask clarifying questions. I'm sorry, Regina, I'm not quite sure what you meant when you said, if I ask Regina a clarifying question like that, I apologize, that's a good point, but I also didn't really understand what you meant by, if I say something, especially frame it like that, Regina knows I was listening. And now she's more than excited to re-clarify what she had said, but more importantly, maybe even willing to listen to what I say next. And that comes back to respecting other people's voices, right? If you're listening carefully, if you're asking other people clarifying questions, it shows that you're respecting their voice and they're going to respect yours. But actually, what we're really respecting them to do is respect your knowledge, because all you're doing is referring to the text to reinforce your point. This is text-based evidence. I ain't interested in just throwing out my opinions and my ideas and thinking I'm right because it feels like I'm right. I'm interested in backing up my claims with sound evidence that is well-reasoned. After all, it's helped me learn this content even more. So the rules for the civil conversation are easy. Everyone participates equally. We listen carefully to everyone, being conscious of asking clarifying questions, respecting each other's voices, and then referring to the text over and over and over again to back up our point. It's all about claims, evidence, reasoning. And then finally, as students work through the article and they have these discussions, they were told how long they would have. We see here in step 4, the reflect and respond component. Students were told how long they had to discuss the actual article, but then they reflect and assess how well they actually used that time. Was it meaningful? They're asked to assess themselves. How much did they talk compared to others in their group? And this will quickly expose anyone who monopolized the conversation, maybe even intimidating others from contributing when they otherwise would have. There's areas to talk about how you benefited the conversation. How much value added was there thanks to your participation? What evidence did you use? This is forcing them to reinforce and reflect upon the evidence that they used. And then finally, what did they learn about the topic overall? And then as the educator, need to take this opportunity in step 4 to carefully create connections between whatever content was delivered in the article and the curriculum that you're covering in class. If you create the connections between the two, this will create lasting understanding between all of your students in class.
Now, Ben, do you mind bringing up the actual article so that they can see that so we can make a few points? And while Ben's doing that, I just wanted to kind of chime in. As a middle school teacher, sometimes we feel like having this type of conversation is a bit more difficult for our students because they just don't have sometimes that filter that the older students do. I will tell you that the more you practice this, the more you have the ground rules in place and you redirect, and so you do not let them respond with, well, I think, or pull in a lot of their own feelings or ideas. That's really what makes it work. So really going back and refocusing on those ground rules. Do not be disappointed if the first conversation does not go as you had intended. You're going to go slow at first to go fast later. It may take a couple times, especially with your middle school students, to perfect that, but it can happen. This article, I think, is actually approachable, both for 7th or 8th grade. For us in North Carolina, 7th grade would be a world history class, and 8th grade would be more of a North Carolina history, but with a super big U.S. focus. So I could see using this in either of 7th or 8th grade. What about you for high school?
Yeah, high school, this serves as a great opportunity to tease up the topic. Many of the articles in the not only this series, but from the Constitutional Rights Foundation are scalable either way. Either it's a good introduction, or sometimes it's something that you could work through the class and practice your annotation skills because it's maybe a little bit more elevated than material that you normally would use. So the article here is Democracy in Decline, again referring back to the introduction that we were referencing earlier. You might see where I pulled my quote sandwich from about by the end of the 1990s, 192 of the nations had adopted the Constitution, 120 out of the 192 nations have adopted. So you saw where I took my quote sandwich from, and students hopefully would be building their own quote sandwiches, at least in conversation, by taking one of the perspectives. We see the first category here, or perspective, is signs of decline, and then as we move down the article, we see signs of hope. And each of these perspectives offers a couple different claims and evidence to back those claims, but it really does open the opportunity for students to bring in their own evidence as well, either things that they already know as prior knowledge, or perhaps you ask them to research examples or talk about current events that would serve as examples.
I do want to point out a couple of features that are really good about this. Again, as a middle school teacher, often our end of grade testing involves having charts and graphs, and the fact that there are two different types of graphs that are shown here, I think is very helpful. And again, the fact that it has U.S. connections, but it mentions
more of a global perspective.
More of a global perspective. I think it could be used for really, any source. For middle school, I would probably pre-teach some vocabulary like the illiberal democracies, and chunk the different topics, perhaps do a little bit of pre-teaching before I let them read on their own, just to set up the scaffolding strategies that would help the students.
Definitely. We also see with this particular lesson article that the discussion questions are provided at the end. You could encourage students to come up with their own, maybe as a exit ticket type activity or a homework assignment, or maybe they're expected to discuss these two specifically and then as a group decide on one additional question that they discuss.
If you're just starting with civil conversation, I would actually, if you were needing a grade for this, I would actually recommend like a ticket out the door or something like that as the actual grade, or perhaps a part of the discussion guide that you'll look at as part of the grade. Later on, after you've got some confidence yourself, you could use a rubric to kind of, as you walk around and you're moderating the groups, because remember, at this point, you're the guy on the side and not the sage on the stage. The students are really owning this with their civil conversation guide and owning that article. So you're not as much interjecting, you are checking for understanding as you go, but a rubric might be helpful if you actually wanted to grade the conversation. But I let them get several civil conversations going before I would make that move.
So I want to ask, what are your thoughts and concerns or even questions about civil conversations, and specifically using the Civil Conversation Guide provided by the Constitutional Rights Foundation? We know that sometimes teachers are a little bit hesitant to use this model because they fear what could result. The organized chaos that might envelop their classroom can be intimidating, but we have to remind ourselves that this is very purposeful. It's very structured. And as we create a culture of using this type of lesson in class, things do get smoothed out over time. As I mentioned earlier, my students really get excited when they know we're going to have a civil conversation and use any of the resources provided by the Constitutional Rights Foundation. Whether it be a role play activity or an article that prompts a civil conversation, my students have never been disappointed by a Constitutional Rights Foundation lesson. So if you would, please feel free to type into the text box what some of your thoughts or concerns or questions, particularly about using the civil conversation, any advice that you think you may need, or problems that you feel could arise in your classroom that you could maybe get some preemptive help in preventing.
We're here for you. Practice makes perfect.
And we want to make sure that you have not just an understanding of why the civil conversation model is so effective and encourage you to use it, but also, of course, where to find it, particularly not just this lesson, but the guide itself, which is used in many of the Constitutional Rights Foundation lessons. So we have two links here for you, both of which you might be able to click from the text box that are provided there. Regina is about to copy and paste for us. I wanted to show you the guide itself one more time in its entirety. I know we chunked it out into different parts, but again, step one, read and annotate. This is help building the skill and encouraging students' engagement with the text. Step two is using the graphic organizer. This is basically like them doing their research and finding the text-based evidence that they'll later discuss. They'll be prompted with questions or come up with their own to really drive the discussion. Step three is the rules for a civil conversation. You set the parameters, reminding students how much time they'll have to actually discuss. Point out, highlight, and accentuate good activity. Use positive reinforcement. And finally, in step four, after the conversation's over, students self-assess, not just really individually, but also as a group, and they reinforce not just the skills that they just used, but hopefully the content as well.
All right, and we also put up where they can find the other Challenge of Democracy articles. Could you click on that and take that to?
The other Challenge of Democracy articles are also showing in the Challenge of Democracy series. In the governance alone, which is what we just went through, we see democracy in decline, but there are many others. What is a constitutional democracy? Amendment process, the role of the judiciary. So there are all kinds of opportunities to use the civil conversation model and deliver it with other content. In this Challenge of Democracy series, we will continue with our webinars next week and then on the 22nd as well. So we highly encourage our participants to join us then and get some more experience, not just using the civil conversation model, but also the role play technique that really helps drive student engagement and excitement in our classrooms.
We really appreciate you coming and being with us tonight. Hope you've learned a little bit.
So on behalf of Ben Conklin and Regina Young, we'd like to thank you again for the participation with the Constitutional Rights Foundation's awesome resources using the civil conversation model. It's been a pleasure. We've had so much success with it in our classrooms that we really are excited whenever we get the opportunity to share it with others. Because we all know that whether democracy is in decline or not right now, it will be guaranteed if our citizens are not capable of having civil conversations that lead to common understanding and the solving of problems.